Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about using the gradient settings and gradient tool on Illustrator. So gradients are a fun way to add more interesting color to your objects, and so let's look at some of the techniques for that. First things first, let's open up and highlight some of the main palettes we're going to be using. So I'm going to go to the window menu and I'm going to make sure that I have swatches open. I'm going to go ahead and expand that here. Also, I'm going to go here and make sure that I have the gradient palette. Scroll down here to there, gradients, have that one open as well. You zoom in here. So I'm going to draw this object, and I'm going to go ahead and pick one of the default gradients sitting in the swatch palette, like this red and yellow gradient, and you can see how it transitions from light to dark, and the gradient palette shows me what that gradient actually looks like. It gives me a slider and indicates the different color swatches that are visible inside that color shape. To adjust, move, or reposition that gradient, you use the gradient tool on the toolbar. That's the one with the little fade on it. So what you do is you click on that tool, and whatever direction you drag with your cursor is going to realign and reposition the direction of that color gradient. That's all you got to do. It's just click and drag. What's nice is with this gradient tool, the way it operates, it also shows you the distribution of those color swatches. And if you're very careful with your cursor, you can click on those items, double click them, and you can actually adjust on the fly right there inside or on top of your object. You can adjust that gradient however you want. It's really handy, so you can get right to those adjustments and make them directly on the object and see how it affects the artwork directly without having to wait or go back and forth with your palette. Another thing you can do is change the type of gradient you have. So right now this is what's called a linear gradient, so it transitions from one side to the next. There's also radial gradients that radiate from the center. This dial is a little bit different. You adjust it by stretching from one side or another. You can still reposition those color swatches, but now it's on a circular pattern, so it radiates from the middle. And if you target your cursor right on those little black circles, those are the adjustment dots. And you can slide, position that gradient somewhere else inside the shape. So one thing to pay attention to, especially for newbies, is pay attention to where you put your cursor. That changes how this thing operates. You can even squish the gradient and make it more of an ellipse. Each one of these little dots give you some sort of control. Now last but not least is a new feature. It's called the Freeform Gradient. What that one does is it adds little adjustment areas. Now I just clicked that and it threw in these colors. It tends to be a little bit random to start. These little dials allow you to move and stretch and reposition gradients within a field. So like it's not on a linear pattern and it's not on a radial pattern, it's on a multi-position pattern. So you can kind of smear your gradients together, stretch them, make them wider. And if you click in an empty space, you'll even add a new one. You can double click it just like the other gradient bar, adjust into a new color, and then you create yourself a little multi-use pattern, or not a multi-style pattern. So that's useful. You want something that looks a little more organic, not quite as rigid or geometric as a linear or radial gradient, but this gives you a lot of custom control. Now, if you end up creating a custom gradient and you want to reuse it and repurpose it, best thing to do is to just come over to your swatch palette and click New Swatch. Oh, I'm sorry. I had selected just that dial. That's not actually what I want. I need to deselect this and use my selection tool so that that entire Freeform Gradient is selected. Now you can see that pattern showing up in my fill box. Now I can click on the new swatch. No, it doesn't want to save my Freeform Gradient. Okay, fine, Illustrator. Don't play along with me. For some reason, it's not allowing me to save that right now. I'll worry about that later. But you can store normal gradients. So let's say I go back to my black and white gradient. Go back to my gradient tool. And let's say I spend a lot of time adjusting and adapting this gradient into something unique, like this pink faded gradient. Click over here. Huh. Yeah, that's weird. Oh, I still have that dumb thing selected. Sorry, you guys, my cursor is acting a little funny. There we go. Now I have the gradient swatch in my fill box. That can be stored and saved as a swatch in my swatch palette. All that work. Okay, there are also other gradients that you can access inside Illustrator. I'm going to go ahead and click the Swatch Library button. Swatch Library button is where you can access pre-existing gradients inside Illustrator. There are a lot of really good color combinations that are stored and hidden here. Let me move this up so it's a little higher on the screen. So click that little New Library Swatch button. Click on Gradients, and then look, you got a couple dozen here that you can select. For example, I'm just going to grab fruits and vegetables. That's going to pull up a new palette with additional color schemes that I can use and adapt. And then using the gradient tools like before, I can readjust them however I want to use them. So by default, the Illustrator swatch palette does not contain a lot of good gradient choices. You really only have that black and white, the red and yellow, the vignette. So if you need a more interesting gradient, a more colorful gradient, you have to go into the library to load the pre-made ones. It's not super easy to make a custom one, so you have to kind of work at it and when you want to build your own. But if you're looking for more variety, use that library button. Alright, so those are some of the basic features using the gradient and adding those colors to your swatches and your shapes. So that's something you can use to make your artwork more colorful and interesting. Alright, thanks a lot. We'll catch up with you later.